The German shepherd's howls pierced the autumn air as Reverend Williams tried to continue the funeral service, his voice trembling against Max's relentless cries. The massive dog clawed frantically at 6-year-old Emma Mitchell's white coffin, his nails scraping against the polished wood with a sound that made every mourner's skin crawl. It wasn't grief, it was desperation. Margaret Mitchell collapsed against her husband James, her weathered hands clutching his arm as Dr. Harrison stepped forward with a syringe. "We need to sedate the animal immediately," Harrison commanded, but Max bared his teeth, positioning himself protectively over the coffin. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence that chilled everyone present. He knew something they didn't. James stared at his granddaughter's coffin, remembering Emma's last whispered words. "Grandpa, Max says the doctor smells like lies." "Get that dog away from her!" someone shouted from the crowd. But then the coffin lid moved. From the inside, what was Max trying to tell them? And why was Dr. Harrison so eager to silence him forever? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Mitchell household had been filled with the kind of quiet contentment that comes after decades of hard work and simple living. James Mitchell, at 68, still carried himself with the straight-backed pride of a Korean War veteran, though his hands now bore the permanent grease stains of 43 years fixing engines in Millbrook's only auto shop. "Trust your gut, not their fancy words," he'd always told his granddaughter Emma, the same philosophy that had guided him through war, marriage, and raising children in small-town Ohio. Margaret, his wife of 45 years, moved through their modest 2-bedroom home with the practiced efficiency of a retired elementary school teacher. At 65, she still corrected grammar at the grocery store and believed firmly that everything happened for a reason. The Lord had taken their son David in Afghanistan and their daughter-in-law Sarah in a car accident just 2 years later, leaving them to raise 6-year-old Emma Rose. "Some burdens are actually blessings in disguise," Margaret would whisper during her evening prayers, watching Emma sleep peacefully in the small bedroom they'd converted from James's workshop. Emma had arrived at their doorstep 3 years ago, a broken little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit and asking when Mommy and Daddy were coming home. Now she was pure sunshine, precocious, intuitive, with an unsettling ability to read people's emotions that both amazed and worried her grandparents. "That man at the store was sad inside," she'd announce after meeting strangers, or "Mrs. Henderson pretends to be happy, but her heart hurts." Margaret attributed it to a child's natural empathy, but James sometimes wondered if losing her parents so young had made Emma sensitive to pain in others. Their 4-year-old German shepherd, Max, had been Emma's constant companion since the day they'd rescued him as a trembling puppy from the animal shelter. The massive dog seemed to understand that this little girl needed extra protection, following her everywhere with devoted amber eyes and sleeping beside her bed every night. James had initially worried about having such a large dog around a small child, but Max displayed an almost supernatural gentleness with Emma, as if he knew she was precious and fragile. Millbrook itself was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, good and bad. Population 2,800, it sat in the heart of Ohio farmland, surrounded by cornfields and connected to the wider world by a single highway. The town had one clinic, one pharmacy, one elementary school, and one doctor who'd served the community for 30 years. Dr. Gerald Harrison was considered a godsend by the aging population, a Harvard-educated physician who'd chosen to practice in rural Ohio rather than pursue wealth in the city. Most families in Millbrook lived paycheck to paycheck, especially the elderly on fixed incomes. Medicare helped, but medical expenses still forced difficult choices between medications and groceries. The Mitchells had been fortunate. James's pension from the auto shop and Margaret's teacher's retirement provided just enough for a comfortable life as long as nothing went wrong. Nothing ever went wrong in Millbrook. Until it did. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Mitchells' backyard as Emma chased Max around the old oak tree, her laughter echoing off the neighbor's barn. It was the kind of perfect September day that made Margaret pause from hanging laundry to watch her granddaughter play. Emma had been unusually energetic all morning, helping with breakfast and chattering about starting first grade next week. "Catch me, Max!" Emma squealed, darting between the clotheslines with the agility of a 6-year-old who knew every inch of her territory. The German shepherd bounded after her, his tail wagging as he deliberately slowed his pace to let her stay ahead. This was their daily ritual, an hour of pure joy before Margaret called them in for afternoon snacks. Then everything changed in an instant. Emma stumbled mid-run, her small hands clutching her chest as her face went pale. She looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why her legs wouldn't work properly. Max immediately stopped playing, his ears alert and his body tense. The dog approached Emma slowly, whining softly as she sank to her knees on the grass. "Grandma," Emma called weakly, her voice barely audible. "Something's wrong." Margaret dropped the wet sheet she'd been hanging and rushed across the yard, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time she reached Emma, the little girl had collapsed completely, her breathing shallow and her lips tinged with blue. Max stood over her protectively, nudging her face with his nose and whimpering in distress. "James!" Margaret screamed toward the house, cradling Emma's limp form. "James, call Dr. Harrison! Something's wrong with Emma!" James burst through the screen door, still holding the newspaper he'd been reading. One look at his unconscious granddaughter sent him racing for the phone in the kitchen. His fingers trembled as he dialed Dr. Harrison's number, a number every family in Millbrook had memorized for emergencies exactly like this. "Doc, it's James Mitchell. Emma just collapsed in the backyard. She's unconscious, and her breathing is—" His voice cracked. "Please, you need to come right now." Dr. Gerald Harrison arrived within 15 minutes, his black medical bag in hand and his usual calm demeanor intact. At 55, he cut an impressive figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bedside manner that had earned him the trust of 3 generations of Millbrook families. He'd delivered half the babies in town, treated everything from broken bones to heart attacks, and never once failed to answer an emergency call. "Let me take a look at her," Dr. Harrison said gently, kneeling beside Emma on the living room couch where James had carried her. His examination was thorough but quick, checking her pulse, listening to her heart, examining her eyes with a small flashlight. Throughout the process, Max paced anxiously nearby, refusing to leave the room despite James's attempts to put him outside. "Has she been complaining of any chest pain, shortness of breath, any family history of heart conditions?" Dr. Harrison asked, his stethoscope still pressed to Emma's chest. Margaret shook her head, wringing her hands. "Nothing. She's been perfectly healthy, active, happy, eating well. This came out of nowhere." Emma stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked confused and frightened, reaching instinctively for Margaret's hand. "Grandma, what happened? I feel dizzy." "You collapsed, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, smoothing Emma's hair. "But Dr. Harrison is here now. He's going to make you feel better." Dr. Harrison smiled reassuringly at Emma, but there was something in his expression that made James uneasy. The doctor reached into his bag and withdrew a small vial and syringe. "I'm going to give you some medicine that will help your heart, Emma. Just a little pinch, and then you'll feel much better." As the needle approached Emma's arm, Max suddenly lunged forward, placing himself between the doctor and the child. The dog's hackles were raised and a low growl rumbled in his throat, something James had never heard from the gentle animal before. "Max, no!" James commanded, grabbing the dog's collar. "Get back! But Max resisted, his amber eyes fixed on Dr. Harrison with an intensity that bordered on hostility. The dog had never shown aggression toward anyone, especially not the town doctor who'd been treating the family for years. "It's all right," Dr. Harrison said calmly, though James noticed a brief flash of annoyance cross his features. "Some animals get protective when their owners are sick. Perhaps we could put him in another room?" Emma's small voice interrupted them. "Max doesn't like the medicine, Grandpa. He says it smells wrong." "Doctor." Harrison chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Children and animals often have strong reactions to medical procedures. It's perfectly normal." He administered the injection despite Max's continued agitation, and within minutes Emma's color began to improve. "She should be fine now," Dr. Harrison assured them, packing his equipment. "But I'll want to see her in my office tomorrow for some follow-up tests. Sometimes, young hearts can be unpredictable." As the doctor left, James couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in their quiet world. The next morning brought no relief. Emma woke pale and listless, complaining of chest pain that seemed to worsen whenever she tried to stand. Margaret hovered over her granddaughter's bed, taking her temperature every hour and watching for signs of improvement that never came. Max had spent the entire night on the floor beside Emma's bed, his ears alert to every sound she made, his amber eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that unnerved the elderly couple. "We need to take her to Dr. Harrison's office," Margaret told James over breakfast, her voice tight with worry. "She's getting worse, not better." James nodded grimly, though something in his mechanic's gut told him this wasn't a problem that could be fixed with another injection. He'd spent 4 decades diagnosing engine troubles, learning to trust the subtle signs that told him when something was fundamentally wrong rather than just temporarily broken. Emma's illness felt like the latter, deep, systemic, dangerous. The drive to Dr. Harrison's clinic took 15 minutes through Millbrook's quiet streets, past the grain elevator and the shuttered 5 and dime store that had closed when Walmart came to the county seat. Emma dozed in the back seat, her small hand resting on Max's head as the German Shepherd sat rigidly beside her, refusing to relax even in the moving car. Dr. Harrison's clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its white clapboard siding and green shutters giving it a homey appearance that had comforted generations of patients. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines, its walls lined with the same Norman Rockwell prints that had hung there since James was a boy bringing his own children for checkups. "The Mitchell family," Dr. Harrison called from his office doorway, his professional smile firmly in place. "How's our patient feeling this morning?" "Worse," Margaret said bluntly, helping Emma to her feet. "She barely slept and her chest pain is getting stronger." Dr. Harrison's examination was more extensive this time. Blood pressure, heart rate, listening carefully to Emma's breathing. Throughout the process, Max paced the small examination room, occasionally whining softly when the doctor touched Emma with his instruments. The dog's behavior was so unusual that even Dr. Harrison commented on it. "Has Max been acting strangely at home as well?" he asked, making notes on Emma's chart. "He won't leave her side," James replied. "Follows her everywhere, won't eat properly. It's like he knows something we don't." Dr. Harrison's pen paused momentarily before he continued writing. "Animals are very sensitive to illness in their families. It's quite common, actually." He turned to Emma with a gentle smile. "Now, sweetheart, I need to ask you some questions. When does your chest hurt the most?" Emma considered this seriously, her 6-year-old mind working to find the right words. "It hurts when you're here," she said finally, with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "And it hurts when I think about the medicine you gave me yesterday." Margaret and James exchanged glances. Dr. Harrison's smile became slightly strained, though he maintained his professional demeanor. "Sometimes medicine can make us feel worse before it makes us feel better," he explained patiently. Like when you get a vaccination. Your arm might hurt for a day or two, but then you're protected from getting really sick. But this isn't like a shot, Emma protested. This feels different. Wrong. She looked at Max, who had stopped pacing and was now sitting directly beside her chair, his body tense and alert. Max thinks so too. Dr. Harrison set down his stethoscope and turned to face James and Margaret directly. I'm going to be honest with you. Emma's symptoms suggest a possible congenital heart defect, something she may have been born with that's only now beginning to cause problems. These conditions can be serious, but they're treatable with proper medical intervention. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Heart defect? But she's never shown any signs before. She's always been so healthy, so active. Unfortunately, some cardiac conditions remain hidden until they're triggered by growth spurts, stress, or other factors, Dr. Harrison explained, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had convinced countless Millbrook families to trust his judgment over the decades. The good news is that we've caught it early. The bad news is that the treatment is going to be expensive and ongoing. James felt his stomach drop. How expensive? We're looking at specialized cardiac monitoring, possibly surgery if the condition worsens, and definitely long-term medication management. Without insurance pre-approval, we could be talking about $15,000 to $20,000 just for the initial diagnostic work. The figure hung in the air like a death sentence. James and Margaret lived comfortably on their combined pensions, but they had exactly $3,400 in their savings account and a monthly budget that left no room for medical emergencies. The thought of going into debt at their age, possibly losing their home, made James's chest tight with anxiety. There might be complications with your insurance coverage as well, Dr. Harrison continued, his tone sympathetic but businesslike. Congenital conditions sometimes fall into gray areas regarding pre-existing condition clauses. I'll need to start Emma on an intensive treatment protocol immediately, which means we'll have to pay up front and hope for reimbursement later. Margaret's hand found James's, their fingers intertwining with the automatic comfort of a couple who'd weathered 45 years of life's storms together. But this felt different, bigger than anything they'd faced before. What choice do we have? Margaret whispered. She's our granddaughter. She's all we have left. Dr. Harrison nodded gravely. I understand this is overwhelming, but Emma's condition is serious enough that delaying treatment could be life-threatening. I've seen these cases before. The children who receive immediate intervention have excellent outcomes. Those who wait. He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. As they scheduled Emma's first round of intensive cardiac therapy for the following day, Max remained glued to Emma's side, his behavior growing more agitated with each passing moment in the clinic. When they finally left, the dog practically dragged Emma toward the car, as if he couldn't wait to get her away from the building. That night, as James lay awake calculating and recalculating their finances, he heard Max pacing in Emma's room, occasionally whining softly in the darkness. For the first time in his life, James Mitchell wondered if his gut instincts might be telling him something his rational mind wasn't ready to accept. Over the next 5 days, Emma's condition deteriorated with alarming speed. Each morning brought new symptoms that Dr. Harrison diagnosed with increasingly complex medical terminology and increasingly expensive treatment protocols. What had started as a simple cardiac episode had evolved into acute myocardial stress syndrome with secondary complications, requiring round-the-clock monitoring and a cocktail of medications that cost more than James's monthly pension. Margaret kept a detailed journal of Emma's symptoms, her teacher's instincts telling her that documentation might be important later. Emma complained of fatigue that seemed to worsen after each of Dr. Harrison's visits. She slept fitfully, often crying out in her dreams, and her appetite had disappeared completely. Most disturbing of all, she seemed to be withdrawing into herself, speaking less and less as the days passed. "She's not getting better," Margaret told James on the third night, her voice breaking as she watched Emma pick listlessly at her dinner. "If anything, she's getting worse. How is that possible with all this treatment?" James had been wondering the same thing. In his experience, when you applied the right fix to a problem, you saw immediate improvement. But Emma seemed to be declining despite, or perhaps because of, Dr. Harrison's intensive care regimen. The thought that crossed his mind was too terrible to voice. What if the treatment was making her sicker? Max's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The normally gentle dog now growled whenever Dr. Harrison's car pulled into their driveway, positioning himself between the doctor and Emma with a protectiveness that bordered on aggression. He refused to eat while Dr. Harrison was in the house and paced frantically whenever the doctor administered Emma's daily injections. "That dog is becoming a real problem, Doctor." Harrison commented on the fourth day, watching Max's hostile reaction to his presence. "This level of stress isn't good for Emma's recovery. Perhaps we should consider boarding him temporarily, just until she's stable." "Absolutely not," Margaret replied firmly. "Max has been Emma's companion since she came to live with us. Separating them now would traumatize her even more." Dr. Harrison's smile remained professionally pleasant, but James caught a brief flash of annoyance in the doctor's eyes. "Of course, you know what's best for your family. I'm simply thinking of Emma's medical needs." That phrase, Emma's medical needs, had become Dr. Harrison's answer to every concern they raised. When Margaret questioned the necessity of so many daily injections, it was for Emma's medical needs. When James asked about seeking a second opinion from a specialist in Columbus, Dr. Harrison explained that delays would compromise Emma's medical needs. When they expressed concern about the mounting bills, they were reminded that Emma's medical needs came first, and financial worries were secondary. By the fifth day, their savings account was empty, and James had been forced to take out a second mortgage on their home. The paperwork sat on their kitchen table like an accusation, the monthly payment amount circled in red ink by the bank loan officer. At their age, with their fixed income, they would never be able to pay it off. They were gambling their security, their home, everything they'd worked for, on Dr. Harrison's assurance that Emma would recover. 43 years I fixed other people's problems," James muttered to Margaret as they sat at their kitchen table surrounded by medical bills and insurance forms. 43 years, and I never once made a problem worse by trying to fix it." "So why does Emma keep getting sicker?" Margaret had been having the same dark thoughts, but hearing James voice them made her feel less alone in her growing doubt. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned something at the grocery store yesterday," she said quietly, glancing toward Emma's room to make sure the little girl was sleeping. "Her grandson Tommy had similar symptoms last year. Dr. Harrison treated him for 3 weeks before he passed." The words hung between them like a curse. They both knew the Henderson family had been devastated not just by Tommy's death, but by the medical bills that had forced them to sell their farm. The Hendersons now lived in a cramped apartment above the hardware store, existing on Social Security and the charity of neighbors. "How many families has this happened to?" James asked. But he wasn't really expecting an answer. In a town as small as Millbrook, patterns became visible if you knew how to look for them. The Hendersons. The Kozlowski family, who'd lost their teenage daughter to sudden cardiac failure 2 years ago. The Williams family, whose elderly father had died after an expensive but unsuccessful treatment for acute respiratory syndrome. All treated by Dr. Harrison. All left with crushing medical debt. All deaths explained by rare but untreatable conditions that had required extensive, expensive intervention. Margaret reached for James's hand across the table. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that when something breaks the same way multiple times, it's not bad luck. It's a design flaw." James's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the anger building beneath his words. And I'm thinking that a man who's fixed engines for 4 decades knows the difference between a part that's failing and a part that's being sabotaged. The conversation was interrupted by sounds from Emma's room, Max barking frantically and Emma crying out in distress. They rushed to her bedside to find her convulsing, her small body racked by seizures that Dr. Harrison later diagnosed as a secondary neurological manifestation of her cardiac condition. "This is actually a positive development," Dr. Harrison explained, as he administered yet another injection to calm Emma's trembling. "It means her body is responding to the treatment. Sometimes things get worse before they get better." But Emma's seizure had lasted nearly 10 minutes, and the terror in her eyes as she gradually regained consciousness was heartbreaking to witness. Max had crawled onto the bed beside her, pressing his warm body against hers as if he could somehow absorb her pain and fear. "Grandma," Emma whispered when she was finally able to speak, "I dreamed I was in a dark place and couldn't get out. Max was trying to dig me out, but the dirt kept falling back in." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Emma's words triggered a memory from her childhood, her grandmother's stories about animals that could sense when someone was going to die, dogs that would howl before a death in the family, cats that would sit vigil beside deathbeds. Margaret had always dismissed these as superstition, but watching Max's desperate protectiveness of Emma made her wonder if there was more truth in old wives' tales than modern medicine wanted to admit. That night, after Dr. Harrison had left with promises to return in the morning with a more aggressive treatment protocol, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She called her sister Ruth in Columbus and asked her to recommend a pediatric cardiologist. "I need a second opinion," Margaret explained, keeping her voice low so James couldn't hear from the living room. "Emma's not getting better, and I'm starting to have doubts about Dr. Harrison's treatment." Ruth was shocked. "Doctor?" Harrison's reputation extended beyond Millbrook. He was known throughout rural Ohio as a dedicated physician who'd sacrificed a lucrative city practice to serve farming communities. "Maggie, are you sure? Gerald Harrison is one of the most respected doctors in the state." "I'm not sure of anything anymore," Margaret admitted. "But my granddaughter is dying, and my dog is trying to tell me something I'm too stubborn to hear." Ruth promised to make some calls, but warned Margaret that getting an appointment with a specialist could take weeks, especially without a referral from Emma's current physician. Dr. Harrison would have to approve the consultation, and most specialists won't see a patient without the primary doctor's blessing. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her dark kitchen, listening to Max pace in Emma's room. The dog hadn't slept properly in 5 days, maintaining a constant vigil that was exhausting him physically, but seemed emotionally necessary. Animals don't lie, Margaret thought. Animals don't have financial motivations or professional egos or complicated explanations for simple problems. She found herself thinking about Dr. Harrison's practice, trying to remember details that had seemed insignificant at the time. His insistence on immediate treatment without consultation, his reluctance to provide copies of Emma's medical records for their insurance claims. His irritation whenever they asked questions about the treatment protocol or suggested involving other medical professionals. Most telling of all was his reaction to Max's hostility. In Margaret's experience, children and animals were excellent judges of character, unclouded by adult assumptions about education, reputation, or social standing. If Max sensed something wrong with Dr. Harrison, maybe the problem wasn't with Max. The next morning brought devastating news. Emma's cardiac event had occurred during the night. Dr. Harrison explained that her heart had stopped for nearly 2 minutes before his emergency intervention had revived her. She was now unconscious, her breathing supported by a portable oxygen machine that Dr. Harrison had somehow procured overnight. "Her condition has progressed beyond what we can manage with outpatient care," Dr. Harrison explained to the shattered grandparents. But unfortunately, the nearest cardiac intensive care unit is in Columbus, and the transfer alone would cost $15,000. Even then, her insurance might not cover emergency admission to an out-of-network facility. James stared at his unconscious granddaughter, her pale face almost lost among the medical equipment that now surrounded her bed. The portable monitors, the oxygen tubes, the IV drip that Dr. Harrison insisted was keeping her alive. It all looked so professional, so necessary, so expensive. "What are our options?" James asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Doctor?" Harrison's expression was grave but compassionate. "I can continue treating her here, but I have to be honest. Her prognosis is poor. The damage to her heart is extensive, and at her age, her body may not be strong enough to recover. We're looking at palliative care now, focused on keeping her comfortable rather than curative treatment." The word palliative hit Margaret like a physical blow. She knew what it meant from her years of teaching, when children in her class had lost grandparents or parents to cancer. Palliative care meant giving up. It meant accepting death. "How long?" she whispered. "Days, not weeks," Dr. Harrison replied gently. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." As Dr. Harrison prepared another injection, this one labeled as comfort medication, Max suddenly lunged from his position beside Emma's bed. The dog knocked the syringe from the doctor's hand, sending it clattering across the hardwood floor, and positioned himself over Emma's unconscious form with a ferocity that James had never seen in the gentle animal. "That dog needs to be removed immediately," Dr. Harrison snapped, his professional composure cracking for the first time. "He's becoming dangerous, and he's interfering with Emma's medical care." But as Max growled at the doctor, Emma's eyes fluttered open for the first time in hours. Her gaze found Max first, then moved to her grandparents, and finally settled on Dr. Harrison with an expression of pure terror. "Don't let him give me any more medicine, Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible but crystal clear. "Please, he's not trying to help me. He's trying to make me go to sleep forever." Emma's whispered accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap, transforming the quiet bedroom into a battlefield of opposing truths. Dr. Harrison's face cycled through expressions of shock, concern, and barely controlled anger as he processed what the 6-year-old had just said. Margaret felt her world tilting on its axis. Everything she'd believed about their trusted family physician suddenly cast in a sinister new light. "Emma, sweetheart, you're very sick," Dr. Harrison said, his voice strained but attempting to maintain its usual gentle authority. "Sometimes, when children are this ill, they can become confused, even paranoid. The medication isn't hurting you. It's the only thing keeping you alive right now." But Emma's small hand found Max's fur, and the contact seemed to give her strength. "No," she said, her voice gaining conviction despite her obvious weakness. "Max knows. He's been trying to tell you, but you won't listen. The medicine makes me feel like I'm drowning from the inside." James felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the situation. His granddaughter's words carried the ring of truth that his mechanic's instincts had been trying to tell him for days. When a customer brought him a car with mysterious engine problems that got worse after each repair, he'd learned to suspect the previous mechanic. The same logic applied here, no matter how much it challenged everything he'd believed about Dr. Harrison. "Get away from her," James said quietly, moving to place himself between the doctor and Emma's bed. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced enemy fire in Korea and wasn't about to back down from a fight in his own home. Dr. Harrison's mask of professional concern began to crack. "James, you're making a serious mistake. Emma needs immediate medical intervention or she will die. I understand that grief and desperation can make people irrational, but The only thing that's been making her worse is your medical intervention, Margaret interrupted, her teacher's voice cutting through Dr. Harrison's explanations like a blade. She was fine until you started treating her. Every day you've been here, she's gotten sicker. Every injection you've given her has made her weaker. Max's growling intensified, and the German shepherd positioned himself more protectively over Emma, his amber eyes never leaving Dr. Harrison's face. The dog's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. He'd been trying to protect Emma from the very person who was supposed to be helping her. Dr. Harrison reached for his medical bag, his movements deliberate and purposeful. I don't have time for this discussion. Emma is dying, and if you prevent me from treating her, you'll be responsible for her death. Is that really a risk you're willing to take? The question was designed to exploit their deepest fear, the possibility that they might be wrong, that their suspicions might cost Emma her life. But as James looked at his granddaughter's pale face, he realized that doing nothing was also a choice, and potentially the wrong one. Emma had been declining steadily under Dr. Harrison's care. What if the real risk was allowing him to continue? "What's in that syringe?" James demanded, moving closer to the doctor. "Life-saving medication," Dr. Harrison replied, but his tone had lost its previous warmth. There was something cold and calculating in his eyes now, the mask of benevolent physician finally slipping completely. "Medication that could mean the difference between life and death for your granddaughter." Emma struggled to sit up, supported by Max's solid presence beside her. "Grandpa, don't let him. Please, I know he's lying." "I can feel it when people lie, and he's been lying since the first day." Margaret remembered all the times Emma had demonstrated this unsettling ability to read people's emotions and intentions. As a teacher, Margaret had seen children with unusual sensitivity to adult deception. But Emma's intuition seemed particularly acute. If the little girl said Dr. Harrison was lying, Margaret was finally ready to believe her. "I want you to leave," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "Leave now, and don't come back." Dr. Harrison's expression darkened. "You're making a fatal mistake. Without proper medical care, Emma will be dead within hours. Her heart is failing, her neurological function is compromised, and her body is shutting down. I'm the only thing standing between her and death." "No," James said, understanding flooding through him with crystal clarity. "You're not standing between her and death. You're the one pushing her toward it." The accusation hit its mark. Dr. Harrison's professional facade crumbled completely, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm a Harvard-educated physician with 30 years of experience. You're a retired mechanic and a school teacher who think you know better than medical science." "Maybe we don't know medical science," Margaret said, stepping closer to Emma's bed. "But we know right from wrong. And we know our granddaughter." Dr. Harrison made one final attempt to reach Emma with the syringe, but Max erupted into protective fury. The massive German shepherd launched himself at the doctor, knocking him backward and sending the medical bag flying across the room. Vials of medication shattered against the wall, their contents pooling on the hardwood floor like evidence of some terrible crime. "Call the police!" Dr. Harrison shouted, scrambling to his feet. "That animal is dangerous. It needs to be destroyed before it hurts someone." But James was already reaching for the phone, and his intention wasn't to report Max's aggression. "Margaret, call 911. Tell them we need an ambulance and police backup. Tell them our doctor may have been poisoning our granddaughter." The words sounded insane even as he spoke them, but they felt true in a way that Dr. Harrison's medical explanations never had. Emma's condition, Max's behavior, the mounting medical bills, the pattern of deaths in their small community. It all suddenly made horrible sense. Dr. Harrison realized that his 30-year reign over Millbrook's medical care was coming to an end. His expression shifted from anger to desperation to something approaching panic. "You're making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your lives. Without my treatment, Emma will die, and her blood will be on your hands." "Then that's a risk we'll have to take," James said, positioning himself between the doctor and his family. "But I'd rather risk losing her to her illness than lose her to your cure." Emma's voice, weak but determined, cut through the tension. "Grandpa, I feel better already. The scary feeling is going away." It was true. Even in the few minutes since Dr. Harrison had been prevented from administering his injection, Emma's color seemed to be improving. She was sitting up straighter, breathing more easily, and her eyes had lost some of their glassy, medicated appearance. Dr. Harrison made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "I'll report this to Child Protective Services. You're endangering a child's life by refusing medical treatment. They'll remove Emma from your custody, and she'll die in state care while you're investigated for child abuse." The threat was designed to terrify them into submission, but Margaret felt only clarity. "Let them investigate. Let them test Emma's blood for whatever you've been putting in those injections. Let them examine your other patients and see how many have died under your care." The sound of sirens in the distance made Dr. Harrison's face go pale. Someone in Millbrook had heard the commotion and called for help, or perhaps Margaret's 911 call had gotten through faster than expected. Either way, Dr. Harrison's time was running out. "This isn't over," he said, gathering what remained of his medical supplies. "You have no idea what you've unleashed. Without proper medical supervision, Emma's condition will deteriorate rapidly. When she dies, and she will die, I want you to remember that you chose this." But as Dr. Harrison spoke, Emma was proving him wrong with every breath. She was sitting up completely now, Max pressed against her side like a furry guardian angel. Her breathing was steadier, her color was returning, and for the first time in days, she looked like a 6-year-old child instead of a dying patient. "I'm not going to die," Emma said, with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Max told me I wasn't really sick. He said the bad man was making me sick, but now the bad man is going away." The sirens were getting closer, and Dr. Harrison finally abandoned his attempt to maintain the pretense of caring physician. His mask was completely gone now, revealing the calculating predator who had been hiding behind 30 years of medical authority. "You'll regret this," he said, heading for the door. "All of you will regret this." But as he left, something remarkable happened. Emma's improvement accelerated visibly, as if Dr. Harrison's very presence had been toxic to her recovery. She was breathing normally, her eyes were clear and alert, and she was able to speak without the labored effort that had characterized her condition for the past week. The ambulance arrived first, followed closely by 2 police officers who seemed confused by the situation they encountered. Instead of a dying child requiring emergency transport, they found Emma sitting up in bed, surrounded by a loving family and a protective dog, looking weak but decidedly alive and improving. "We got a call about a medical emergency," one of the paramedics said, looking around the room with obvious bewilderment. "The emergency is over," Margaret said, her arm around Emma's shoulders. "But we need to talk to someone about our doctor. We think he's been deliberately making our granddaughter sick." The paramedics' initial assessment of Emma confirmed what her grandparents had begun to suspect. She was recovering at a rate that defied Dr. Harrison's dire predictions. Her heart rate was stabilizing, her breathing was clear, and blood tests showed traces of sedatives and other medications that had no business being in a 6-year-old system. The lead paramedic, a veteran named Rodriguez, who'd worked rural Ohio for 15 years, had never seen anything quite like it. "Her vitals are actually improving while we watch," Rodriguez told the police officers who'd responded to the call. "Whatever was making her sick seems to be clearing out of her system rapidly, But these medication levels, he shook his head grimly. This child has been systematically drugged. Detective Sarah Chen arrived from the county sheriff's office within an hour, drawn by the paramedics' radio report of suspected medical abuse. Chen was a methodical investigator who'd built her reputation on following paper trails and connecting dots that others missed. At 42, she'd seen enough cases of fraud and abuse to recognize the patterns when they emerged. "Tell me everything," Chen said, settling into the Mitchells' living room with a notebook and recording device. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any details that seemed unimportant at the time." Margaret and James took turns recounting the past week, from Emma's initial collapse to Max's increasingly agitated behavior to the mounting medical bills that had forced them to mortgage their home. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly absorbing the full scope of what appeared to be a calculated scheme of medical fraud and attempted murder. "Dr. Harrison has been our family doctor for 30 years, James explained, his voice heavy with betrayal. "We trusted him completely. Everyone in town did. He delivered our children, treated our parents when they were dying, helped us through every medical crisis. The idea that he could be deliberately harming people—" His voice trailed off. Chen had already begun running Dr. Harrison's name through state medical databases, looking for patterns of unusual patient outcomes or insurance claims. What she found made her stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, Millbrook had experienced an unusually high rate of deaths from rare cardiac and neurological conditions, all treated extensively and expensively by Dr. Harrison before the patients died. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," Chen said gently. "Can you think of other families in Millbrook who've experienced similar situations? Sudden illnesses, expensive treatments, poor outcomes?" Margaret and James exchanged glances, both thinking of the same tragic cases. The Henderson family's grandson Tommy, the Kozlowski daughter who'd died of sudden cardiac failure, the Williams patriarch who'd succumbed to acute respiratory syndrome after weeks of costly but unsuccessful treatment. "There have been others," Margaret admitted. "We thought it was just bad luck or maybe the stress of living in a poor rural community. People here don't always eat well, don't always take care of themselves properly. We assume that's why we seem to have so many medical tragedies." Chen's investigation was revealing a different pattern entirely. Dr. Harrison's patient mortality rate was significantly higher than state averages, but his billing rates were among the highest in rural Ohio. Families who'd lost loved ones under his care consistently reported financial devastation from medical bills, often losing homes and savings to pay for treatments that had ultimately failed. He's been doing this for years, Chen realized, the scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. Creating medical emergencies, providing expensive but ineffective treatments, and collecting insurance money while his patients either died or recovered just enough to avoid suspicion. The detective's phone rang with an update from the state medical board. Dr. Harrison's medical license had been flagged multiple times over the past decade for unusual prescribing patterns and suspicious patient outcomes. But rural communities were so desperate for medical care that oversight agencies had been reluctant to remove their only healthcare provider. Meanwhile, Emma continued to improve with each hour that passed without Dr. Harrison's treatment. She was sitting up, eating small amounts of food, and even managing to play gently with Max. The German Shepherd seemed to sense that the danger had passed. His aggressive vigilance had been replaced by his usual gentle protectiveness, though he still refused to leave Emma's side. "How did you know?" Chen asked Emma, crouching down to the little girl's eye level. "How did you know that Dr. Harrison was lying?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. "He smelled wrong," she said finally, "like when you tell a story that isn't true but stronger. And his hands were always cold, even when it was warm outside. Max knew, too. Dogs can smell lies better than people can." Chen had worked enough cases involving children to know that their perceptions, while often dismissed by adults, could be remarkably accurate. Children hadn't yet learned to ignore their instincts in favor of social expectations or authority figures. If Emma had sensed something wrong with Dr. Harrison from the beginning, it was likely because something had been genuinely wrong. The afternoon brought devastating confirmations of Chen's suspicions. A search warrant for Dr. Harrison's clinic and home revealed a sophisticated medical fraud operation that had been running for nearly 2 decades. Insurance claims totaling over $3 million, fake medical records documenting non-existent conditions, vials of medications that had been diluted or contaminated to prolong illnesses rather than cure them. Most damning of all was Dr. Harrison's personal computer, which contained detailed financial records showing how much money he'd extracted from each family's insurance policies and personal savings. The Mitchell family was listed with projected earnings of $127,000, the amount Dr. Harrison expected to collect from Emma's treatment before her inevitable death. "He's been playing the long game," Chen explained to the gathered investigators. "Create a medical crisis, extract maximum insurance money and personal savings through expensive but ineffective treatments, then let the patient die of natural causes related to their condition." The families are left devastated financially and emotionally, but they're also grateful for his efforts to save their loved ones. The community response was a mixture of horror, disbelief, and rage. Neighbors who'd trusted Dr. Harrison with their lives and the lives of their children struggled to accept that their beloved physician had been systematically destroying families for profit. Some refused to believe the evidence, insisting that there must be some mistake or misunderstanding. Others, like the Henderson family, felt a crushing mixture of relief and anguish. Their grandson Tommy's death hadn't been inevitable. He'd been murdered for insurance money. The medical bills that had cost them their farm had been payment for their own child's assassination. 30 years, Mrs. Henderson wept when Chen delivered the news. 30 years we trusted him. How many children did he kill? How many families did he destroy? The investigation revealed at least 17 suspicious deaths over the past 2 decades, with dozens more cases of families financially ruined by unnecessary medical treatments. Dr. Harrison had been particularly effective at targeting elderly patients and children, populations whose deaths from rare conditions would raise fewer questions. As evening fell, Dr. Harrison was arrested at the county line, attempting to flee toward Columbus with a suitcase full of cash and false identification documents. His arrest was anticlimactic compared to the magnitude of his crimes. A middle-aged man in handcuffs, looking more like a disgraced accountant than a serial killer who'd been hiding behind a medical degree. Emma's recovery continued to accelerate. By nightfall, she was eating normally, playing with her toys, and showing no signs of the life-threatening condition that Dr. Harrison had diagnosed. Blood tests confirmed that the medications in her system were clearing out, replaced by the normal chemistry of a healthy 6-year-old. "She's going to be fine," the emergency room doctor from Columbus confirmed after a thorough examination. "Whatever she was given has caused no permanent damage. Her heart is strong, her neurological function is normal, and she should make a complete recovery within days." Max seemed to understand that his vigil was over. For the first time in a week, the German shepherd relaxed completely, curling up beside Emma's bed and falling into the deep sleep of a guardian whose watch had ended successfully. But for the Mitchell family and the community of Millbrook, the healing process was just beginning. Trust, once shattered, would take years to rebuild. The financial devastation caused by Dr. Harrison's scheme would require legal battles and insurance investigations to resolve. And the families who'd lost loved ones to his greed would carry that grief forever. That night, as Emma slept peacefully for the first time in a week, Margaret and James sat in their kitchen trying to process what they'd discovered. Their granddaughter was alive because they'd finally chosen to trust a dog's instincts over a doctor's authority. "How do we ever trust anyone again?" Margaret whispered. James looked toward Emma's room where Max maintained his gentle watch over the sleeping child. "We start with the ones who've never lied to us," he said quietly, "and we learn to listen when they try to tell us the truth." The full scope of Dr. Harrison's deception emerged over the following weeks like a cancer being surgically removed from the community's body. Detective Chen's investigation, supported by state medical fraud investigators and FBI financial crimes specialists, revealed a conspiracy that stretched back 23 years to Harrison's first suspicious patient death. His own wife, Catherine Harrison, who had died of complications from routine surgery just 6 months after a hefty life insurance policy had been purchased, Emma's blood work told a horrifying story. The toxicology reports revealed a cocktail of medications designed not to heal, but to create symptoms that mimicked serious cardiac and neurological conditions. Digoxin to cause heart arrhythmias, benzodiazepines to create confusion and seizures, small doses of insulin to cause hypoglycemic episodes that looked like fainting spells. Dr. Harrison had been poisoning Emma systematically, creating a medical emergency that justified expensive interventions while slowly killing her. "He's a sociopath with medical training," Dr. Patricia Williams, the child psychologist brought in to evaluate Emma, explained to Margaret and James. "He understood exactly how to manipulate both the human body and human emotions. He created genuine medical crises that required real treatment, then provided ineffective or harmful interventions that prolonged suffering while maximizing profit." The financial investigation revealed the true scope of Harrison's greed. Over 2 decades, he had extracted an estimated $4.2 million from families and insurance companies through fraudulent medical claims. The Mitchells case was typical. A sudden health crisis leading to expensive daily treatments, mounting bills that forced families to liquidate their savings and take out loans, followed by either death or miraculous recovery just before the family's resources were completely exhausted. Margaret found herself thinking about all the families who had thanked Dr. Harrison for his heroic efforts to save their loved ones, never knowing that he had been the one putting them in danger. The Kozlowski family, who had erected a memorial plaque in the town square thanking Dr. Harrison for his dedication to their daughter's care. The Williams family, who had insisted on paying for Dr. Harrison's attendance at their father's funeral. The Henderson family, who had borrowed money they couldn't afford to pay for their grandson's treatment. "We were all victims," Mrs. Henderson said during a community meeting called to address the crisis. "But we were also enablers. We gave him godlike authority over our lives because we were desperate and grateful to have any medical care at all." The ripple effects of Harrison's arrest extended far beyond his immediate victims. Millbrook found itself without any medical care, as no legitimate physician wanted to practice in a community associated with such a massive fraud scandal. Residents were forced to drive 45 minutes to the county seat for routine medical care, creating hardships for elderly and disabled community members who had depended on Harrison's accessibility. Emma's recovery proved to be the strongest evidence against Dr. Harrison's medical competence. Within 3 days of his arrest, she was completely back to normal, running, playing, eating well, and showing no signs of the life-threatening cardiac condition he had diagnosed. Independent medical evaluations confirmed that she had never had a heart defect. Her only illness had been the systematic poisoning administered by the man she and her family had trusted to heal her. Max's behavior returned to normal as well, though he remained more protective of Emma than before. The German shepherd seemed to understand that he had saved his little girl's life, carrying himself with a quiet pride that the entire community recognized. Local media outlets picked up the story of the dog who had detected medical fraud when human authorities had failed, making Max a regional celebrity. The legal proceedings against Dr. Harrison revealed the calculated nature of his crimes. Prosecutors found detailed records of his victims, including notes about their financial situations, insurance coverage limits, and family dynamics. He had specifically targeted vulnerable populations: elderly patients with substantial savings, families with good insurance coverage, and children whose parents would spare no expense for medical care. He was a predator who used his medical degree as a hunting license, prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez explained during Harrison's arraignment. He identified vulnerable families, created medical emergencies to justify intervention, then systematically drained their resources while providing treatment designed to prolong suffering rather than promote healing. Harrison's defense attorney attempted to argue that his client was a dedicated physician who had made mistakes in judgment, but the evidence was overwhelming. 23 suspicious deaths, dozens of families financially ruined by unnecessary treatments, detailed computer records showing his profit calculations for each patient. The case against him was ironclad. The emotional toll on the community was devastating. Many residents struggled with guilt over their failure to recognize the pattern of deaths and financial devastation. Others felt angry at themselves for not listening to subtle warning signs they had dismissed at the time. The trust that held the small community together had been shattered by the revelation that their most respected citizen had been systematically destroying them. Margaret found herself questioning everything she had believed about authority, expertise, and trust. As a retired teacher, she had always emphasized to her students the importance of respecting doctors, following medical advice, and trusting educated professionals. Now she wondered how many other authority figures might be abusing the trust placed in them. James struggled with his own demons. His military training had taught him to follow orders and trust in the chain of command, but his mechanic's instincts had been telling him something was wrong with Harrison's treatments from the beginning. He tortured himself with questions about why he had ignored his gut feelings in favor of deferring to medical authority. "I knew something was wrong," he told Detective Chen during one of their follow-up interviews. "A man doesn't fix engines for 43 years without learning to recognize when something is being broken intentionally instead of accidentally. But I talked myself out of trusting my instincts because he was a doctor and I was just a mechanic." Emma, surprisingly, seemed to handle the revelation better than the adults around her. Children's natural resilience, combined with her recovery from Harrison's poisoning, left her more curious than traumatized by the experience. She asked straightforward questions about why Dr. Harrison had wanted to hurt her, accepted the explanations provided by adults, and moved on with the adaptability that children possess. "Bad people sometimes pretend to be good people," she explained to Max during one of their garden conversations that Margaret overheard, "but dogs always know the difference." "Next time I'll listen to you right away." The financial recovery process proved complex and lengthy. Harrison's assets were seized and liquidated to provide restitution to his victims, but the amount recovered was only a fraction of what he had stolen over the years. The Mitchells were fortunate. Their second mortgage was forgiven by the bank once the fraud was proven, and their insurance company reimbursed them for the medical bills they had paid. Other families were not as lucky. The Henderson family's farm was gone forever, sold to pay for medical bills that should never have existed. The Kozlowski family's retirement savings had been depleted by their daughter's unnecessary treatments, leaving them dependent on Social Security in their old age. Some families would never fully recover from the financial devastation Harrison had caused. Community support networks emerged to help families cope with both the emotional and financial aftermath of Harrison's betrayal. Churches organized assistance programs for the most severely affected families. Local businesses donated services and goods to help people rebuild their lives. The tragedy had shattered trust in authority, but it had also strengthened bonds between neighbors who recognized their shared vulnerability. 6 weeks after his arrest, Dr. Harrison pled guilty to 17 counts of murder, dozens of counts of insurance fraud, and multiple charges related to practicing medicine with intent to harm. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing legal closure to his victims, even as the emotional healing process continued. The day of Harrison's sentencing, Margaret and James took Emma to visit the courthouse where justice was finally served. They wanted her to understand that bad people eventually face consequences for their actions, and that the system, while imperfect, could still deliver justice when the truth was finally revealed. As they left the courthouse, Emma spotted a therapy dog working with a young patient in the hospital across the street. "Look, Max," she said to her own four-legged hero. "That dog is helping someone, just like you helped me." Margaret realized that their ordeal, as traumatic as it had been, had taught them valuable lessons about trust, instinct, and the importance of listening to voices that society often dismisses. Emma had learned to trust her own perceptions. James had learned to value his intuitive knowledge alongside formal expertise. Margaret had learned that love and protective instincts could be more reliable than professional credentials. The Mitchell family had been tested by a predator who exploited their trust and vulnerability, but they had emerged stronger and wiser. They had learned that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unlikely sources: a child's honesty, a dog's loyalty, and an old couple's stubborn refusal to let go of love. 6 months after Dr. Harrison's sentencing, spring had returned to Millbrook with a sense of renewal that the community desperately needed. The Mitchell household had found its rhythm again, though it was forever changed by their brush with evil disguised as healing. Emma, now 7 years old and thriving in first grade, had grown into a more confident child who trusted her instincts while still maintaining the joyful innocence that made her special. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Margaret prepared Emma's favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes shaped like hearts. It had become their Saturday tradition, a small celebration of life and family that felt more precious now than it ever had before. James sat at the table reading the newspaper, occasionally sharing local news that actually mattered to their quiet lives, carefully avoiding the crime stories that might remind them of darker times. "Grandma, can we take Max to the therapy dog training today?" Emma asked, cutting her pancakes into careful pieces and saving the biggest bite for last, as always. "Mrs. Rodriguez said he's the smartest dog she's ever worked with." Max had indeed become something of a local legend. After Emma's recovery, the regional hospital had invited him to join their animal therapy program, recognizing that his protective instincts and unusual sensitivity could benefit other patients. Twice a week, Margaret drove Max and Emma to the medical center in Columbus, where they visited children who were genuinely sick and could benefit from the gentle presence of a dog who understood suffering. "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret replied, watching her granddaughter's face light up with purpose. Emma had discovered that helping other sick children gave meaning to her own traumatic experience. She would sit beside hospital beds, sharing her story of how Max had saved her life, giving hope to families who were struggling with legitimate medical crises. James folded his newspaper and looked at his wife and granddaughter with the deep contentment of a man who had almost lost everything and gotten it back. "Before we go, we should stop by the Henderson place. I promised Harold I'd take a look at his truck's transmission." The Henderson family had become close friends with the Mitchells in the aftermath of Harrison's exposure. Shared trauma had created bonds that went deeper than their previous neighborly acquaintance. Harold Henderson, now in his 70s, had struggled to maintain his small farm after losing the larger property to medical bills, but the community had rallied around him with practical support and genuine affection. Margaret packed an extra plate of pancakes for the Hendersons, a gesture that had become automatic in the months since the truth had come out. Food was love in Millbrook, and everyone seemed to need extra love these days. The simple act of sharing meals had become a way for neighbors to check on each other's emotional well-being without having to ask difficult questions. The drive to the Henderson place took them past the site where Dr. Harrison's clinic had once stood. The building had been demolished 3 months earlier, and the empty lot now hosted a small memorial garden planted by families who had lost loved ones to Harrison's greed. Wild flowers and native plants grew where the House of Horrors had once dispensed death, disguised as medicine. "I still can't believe we trusted him for so long," Harold Henderson said, as James examined his truck's engine. The two men had developed a friendship based on their shared experience of having their trust betrayed by someone they had considered a pillar of their community. "We trusted him because we needed to," James replied, his experienced hands feeling for problems in the transmission. "In a place like this, you don't have the luxury of shopping around for doctors. You trust the one you have, or you go without medical care entirely." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, no relation to the family despite sharing their surname. Dr. Mitchell had volunteered to establish a new medical practice in Millbrook, drawn by the community's need and the story of how they had survived medical fraud. She was young, idealistic, and determined to rebuild trust in healthcare through transparency and community involvement. "How's our local hero doing?" Dr. Mitchell asked, crouching down to pet Max, who accepted her attention graciously but maintained his protective position near Emma. The new doctor had made it a point to befriend Max, understanding that the dog's approval would be crucial to gaining the community's trust. "He's doing wonderful," Emma replied with the confidence of a child who had learned that her voice mattered. "We're going to visit sick children today. Max helps them feel less scared." Dr. Mitchell smiled, remembering her own first meeting with Emma 3 months earlier. The little girl had interviewed the new doctor with the seriousness of a hiring committee, asking pointed questions about her intentions and motivations. Emma's approval had been essential to Dr. Mitchell's acceptance by the community, and the 7-year-old had taken that responsibility seriously. The new medical practice operated on principles of radical transparency that would have been unthinkable before Harrison's crimes were exposed. Treatment plans were explained in detail, with multiple options presented to patients. Second opinions were encouraged and facilitated. Financial discussions happened before treatments began, with clear explanations of costs and alternatives. Most importantly, family members and even pets were welcome during medical consultations. "The children at the hospital are looking forward to your visit," Dr. Mitchell told Emma. "There's a little boy named Timothy who's been asking about Max all week. He's recovering from surgery and he's scared about going home." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of her new role as a peer counselor for traumatized children. She had discovered that her experience with Harrison gave her unique credibility with young patients who were struggling to trust medical professionals. Her presence, combined with Max's therapeutic skills, provided comfort that adult counselors couldn't match. The drive to Columbus took them through the Ohio countryside that had shaped their family for generations. Rolling hills covered with corn and soybeans stretched to the horizon, punctuated by farmhouses and barns that represented the steady, honest work that built communities like Millbrook. It was a landscape that valued reliability over flash, substance over style, and truth over convenience. At the hospital, Emma and Max were greeted like celebrities by the nursing staff who had witnessed their impact on pediatric patients. Children who had been withdrawn and frightened began to open up after spending time with the little girl who had survived her own medical nightmare and the dog who had saved her life. Timothy, the boy Dr. Mitchell had mentioned, was indeed waiting eagerly for their arrival. 8 years old and recovering from appendix surgery, he had developed a fear of medical procedures that was complicating his recovery. His parents were at their wits' end, trying to convince him that not all doctors were dangerous. "This is Max," Emma said, guiding the German shepherd to Timothy's bedside. "He saved my life when a bad doctor was trying to hurt me. Now he helps other kids feel safe." Max seemed to understand his role intuitively, placing his large head on Timothy's bed and allowing the boy to pet his soft fur. Within minutes, Timothy was sharing his fears about doctors and hospitals, finding comfort in talking to someone who truly understood his anxiety. "How did you know the doctor was bad?" Timothy asked, his young mind trying to process the concept that helpers could sometimes be harmful. "Max knew first," Emma explained patiently. "Dogs can smell when people are lying or when they want to hurt you. And I could feel it in my heart that something wasn't right. You have to trust your feelings, even when grown-ups tell you not to." Margaret watched from the doorway as her granddaughter shared wisdom that had been earned through trauma but transformed into hope. Emma had learned to trust her instincts while still remaining open to help from good people. She had developed the rare ability to be both cautious and optimistic, protective and loving. As afternoon turned to evening, the Mitchell family drove home through the peaceful countryside, their hearts full of purpose and gratitude. They had discovered that surviving evil was only the beginning. Transforming that survival into service for others was what gave their experience meaning. "Do you think Timothy will be okay?" Emma asked as they pulled into their driveway. "I think he's going to be fine," James replied, watching Max bound out of the car toward his favorite spot in the backyard. "He's got good people taking care of him now, and he's learned to trust his instincts." That evening, as Emma played in the garden with Max under Margaret's watchful eye, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. They had faced the worst that humanity could offer, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to each other and their community. The truth had set them free, but love had given them the courage to use that freedom to help others find their own path to healing and hope. In a world where we're taught to trust experts and defer to authority, sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources. A child's innocent honesty, a loyal dog's protective instincts, and the unshakable bond of family love. The Mitchell family's journey reminds us that our gut feelings, honed by decades of life experience, are often more reliable than fancy credentials or prestigious titles. At 55, 60, or 68, we've earned the right to trust our instincts, especially when something feels wrong about the people we're supposed to trust most. Emma's story shows us that even in our darkest moments, when systems fail and trusted figures betray us, love finds a way to triumph. Max's unwavering loyalty proves that sometimes the purest hearts see clearest, and that protecting those we love requires the courage to stand against authority when necessary. This isn't just a story about medical fraud. It's about the power of family bonds, the wisdom that comes with age, and the beautiful truth that we're never too old to learn, grow, and fight for what matters most. What moments in your life have you trusted your gut over expert advice? Have you ever had a pet that seemed to know something you couldn't see? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter and could help others trust their own instincts.